So, I thought I might start off by saying a few words about the race that is the ostensible reason we are here today. This runoff election between Reverend Dr. Warnock, who is both a sitting senator and still the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which was Dr. King's church. Um, and Herschel Walker, former NFL star, Heisman Trophy winner. I mean, somebody who in the world of athletics has been highly, highly praised in the past. But as you might have noticed, maybe since you're here, this race is really, really working with two poles, two seemingly diametrically opposed poles for what it is to be a Black man in America. And it's a close race. It remains close. It was so close, neither got 50%, so now we're in the runoff. And polls in recent days, and yes, if you're a politico like me, you know that polls just kind of don't even matter anymore. But what the polls have been showing is it is very much a dead heat. We have, some polls just in the past 2 to 3 days that have come out showing Warnock on top. Some have come out showing Walker on top by anywhere between 1 to 4% either way. So it really is a seat in the Senate that's hanging in the balance. And that matters when that seat is going to be occupied by somebody who inhabits his Black masculinity one way, or somebody who inhabits his Black masculinity completely the other. And so, we decided it'd be a really good thing to get together here today and talk a little bit about what the implications of those are, kind of how we got here, what some of the history is of, having those two diametrically opposed forms of Black masculinity even available. And so, yeah, but, because so much of my concern is always on, Blackness doesn't exist in a vacuum. So much of my concern is always on this Black-white racial matrix and everything else that means for all the people in the Western world who don't identify as either Black or white, right? So we have to keep that in mind. But because it all tends to come back to, and if you come to one of my classes, I would tell you, it goes all the way back to Aristotle that things get pushed into Blackness or whiteness. So since we have our, a resident, he's one of my resident experts on whiteness and identity here. Dan, could you start off our conversation with just sort of a story about, for you, the intersections of masculinity and whiteness and all that good stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Cord. I'd love to. It's funny, the story that comes to mind is not particularly flattering, but it's one that I find funny, and I think we got to bring humor into this conversation to really be human together. So my story starts, it would be about 4 or 5 years ago. I was super hooked on these kombucha drinks. GT's kombucha, they had all these different flavors. They sounded amazing. So I walked in the grocery store one day and I went right over to the kombucha shelf, and there's all these bright bottles glistening back at me. And I was thinking to myself, I think I've tried all of these. I don't think I've even had a single one that I haven't tried. Finally, there's this bottle that catches my eye right in the center. And it's this pink bottle with a silver trimming. And it says, Guava Goddess. And I sort of step back. I look around, the coast is clear, pick it up. And I think to myself, I got to try it. This is the only one I haven't tried. Let's go. So I start the probably a 40-foot journey to the cash register, which felt like a mile. And as I was walking, kind of puffed my chest out a little bit, rolled my shoulders back. And at one point I caught the eye of the cashier. There wasn't even a line there. And she looked back at me and I looked at her. And I was brought right back to a moment in college when I was buying tampons for a girlfriend at the time. And there was this voice in my head that I was trying to send through my gaze that said, these aren't for me. and and I finally got up to her, and I put the kombucha there at the cash register. Surprisingly, no incident. Got right through, no comment about my masculinity, and checked out just fine. But as I walked out that door, and also later, as I reflected further, it kind of hit me. How fragile is my masculinity that I'm afraid of a pink drink, that I'm afraid that somebody's going to make fun of me or tear me down or call me less than a man because I chose guava goddess kombucha. And so then it struck me, if I can be silenced by a drink, then where else am I being silent? Where else in my life am I not taking a stand because it feels too risky? And that has been quite an exploration, and I'm still in it today. But that's part of what brings us to our conversation now, is the exploration of where I feel held back by a lonely, confining culture of masculinity and a lonely, confining culture of whiteness. So that's my story. Thanks for asking.
Well, thanks for that, Dan. It's funny. Your story, which is just great, because Guava Goddess is very good kombucha. But your story reminds me of, even reminds me of two. Something that happened just the other day, which will lead me into a story that matches yours a little bit more. But just the other day, I'm in a department store, and it's a department store that has codes for the bathroom. And my wife and daughter and mother are all trying to get into the women's room. And no one with the code is anywhere to be found. So I go, I'm walking clean across this huge store till I finally find somebody. And I ask him for the code to the women's room. And he looks at me quizzically and goes, do you mean the men's room? And and I respond, and I just respond, no, I mean the women's room, because I'm like, how do you, but, but his reaction, like, I couldn't possibly be asking for the code for the women's room. But I think I reacted, I think I was able to react with less worry now because of some experiences I've had in the past as well. I mean, let's put it this way. I grew up in a world where men don't get manicures and pedicures, right? That's just something we don't do. And, or at least that's what it seemed to me at the time. Until I was turned on to getting pedicures by one of the most hyper masculine men I have known. And this will sort of take us a bit more into our politics, but I'll say that when a few years back now, and for those who don't know, I'm in an interracial marriage. My wife identifies as white and comes from a very conservative family. And over years, her father and I, we did work to build a relationship, and I think we built quite a beautiful one by the end of his life. But we were visiting with him one day and walking along, and it just sort of came up that that my wife would love me to get a pedicure with her sometime. She'd been working on me about this. And I'm like, no, like I can't do that. It's like picking up Guava Goddess off the shelf. It can't be done. And so walking along, and then her father, who is, extremely conservative, very much believed in, the right to own and have guns, who, I think I remember bathroom controversy in North Carolina had really shocked him. He was just, kind of even just amazed by the mere existence of trans people. Um, and yeah, and on race, he took a lot of education too. But he looked at me quizzically and said, "Well, why wouldn't you get a pedicure? They're amazing." And revealed that he'd been getting pedicures for years. So, so with that in my back pocket, I eventually probably took about another 3 years after that before I actually had a pedicure. But it has moved on to the point now where I, as a Philadelphia Eagles fan, am even willing, and I'm going to try to show you all this, am even willing to do this. I don't know if you can see that, but there go the Eagles on my nails. So, I had to do that after they lost, one game this whole season. I had to up my fandom. But, but that sort of gets to I think that kind of brings us actually to a question I have for you, Dan, because when it comes to Walker and Warnock, like, I know, God rest his soul, were my father-in-law still alive, he would likely be voting for Warnock. And as much as we built a relationship, I still have trouble discerning why. What my biases are real. As a Black man who's fashioned my life a lot closer to the way that Reverend Warnock has, I find it difficult to see what voters would see in Herschel Walker. I find it difficult to see what would appeal to the, let's say, to the, not that anyone's a monolith, not that any group's a monolith, but what would appeal to the white male GOP voter about Herschel Walker at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the only way that I can possibly answer it is by looking at my own white enculturation and psychology around it, and then imagining what might be true for Georgia GOP voters. I just want to start by saying, though, that racism is not a Southern thing only. It's not a GOP thing only. It's, I live outside of Boulder, Colorado, one of the most progressive cities in the country. And there's an incredible amount of racism here. So I just want to acknowledge that before I dive in any further. And I think, my brief answer would be he's a convenient cover for structurally racist GOP policies. There's a party that has been perhaps doing more than any other to maintain the domination-based structure in our society, and to continue to center the needs and desires and the humanity of white and often landowning men. And so I think when you enter a race with an incumbent who is a charismatic Black man, Warnock, I think Trump's calculation was to find another Black man who could kind of move through the question around race without incident, rather than pushing up against and showing a contrast to Georgian voters. And of course, that couldn't be further from the truth, because as you pointed out, the contrast is absolutely enormous. And I think that hints at the reductionist view of people like Trump when they think about racial identity, that, just let's get a Black man, without actually understanding the incredible complexity and nuance and diversity that exists within any group or community. And so that sort of brings me to, and I'd love to answer that further, maybe a little further down, but it brings me to a question I have for you, which is looking at, I guess when we came into this conversation, we came in with this assertion that both Warnock and Walker represent Black male stereotypes. And I'd be interested to hear from you, which stereotypes do you see each of them being assigned, and what sort of impact is that having on this race?
Hmm. I think that's a great question, Dan. For Walker, what I see, and I've already admitted I don't find any of this appealing, but what I see is, I mean, he does offer kind of hyper masculinity, right? He offers this kind of, individualist, pugilistic, I'll fight you on the street kind of approach. Which also it doesn't seem to care for any kind of niceties. Even the fact that this past weekend he didn't even bother to campaign. A lot of the political sphere, a lot of the political media sphere is like, what on earth, like, has he just given up? He's hasn't even bothered to campaign, except the polls aren't acting like he hasn't given up. So what is, like, he has given up. So what is this, right? But it's showing a lot, in a lot of the same ways Trump did, a disregard for political norms. And I think that is in line with a certain stereotype, with a significant stereotype of Black men as unmannered, uninterested in norms, brash. Um, at the same time, all this any scandal that surrounds him is also in that same vein, right? Scandals about children born out of wedlock, even though he paid for the abortions. The children born out of wedlock part fits perfectly the stereotype of the hypersexualized Black male. The Even just being an athlete, right? No, he's got all the brawn, the physical strength, and then the fact that even a lot of his speeches don't make a whole lot of semantic sense. Um, you know, I I mean, I am not a medical doctor, but he did get knocked in the head a lot playing the game. Um, but the fact that they don't make a lot of semantic sense also hits the idea that he's unlearned, and that too is perfectly in line with some of the worst stereotypes about Black men, and it intersects with some stereotypes that have become increasingly popular about men in general. Right? So he's also crossing a bit of a racial line, because also, I mean, if he's a Trump acolyte, Trump also often makes no sense, and Trump supporters tend to like that, right? Because it also hits that stereotype. Now, in a way, what that says is, that he doesn't care about stereotypes, that he's not interested in avoiding seeming like one, because obviously he just kind of goes right in for any number of them. Um, so that's one side of the coin here. The other side with Reverend Warnock, Reverend Warnock has very much played the game of respectability politics. It's a game that I have played throughout my life as well. In which you do everything in your power to seem above reproach, to seem as mannered as possible. You're wearing a suit all the time. As I was taught, as I was taught by my own father, you only speak the King's English outside of the home. Right? In the home, you can speak African American vernacular English, but never outside. Right? You just make sure everything's as on the up and up as possible. Even the only scandal to kind of attach itself to Reverend Warnock at all, and I don't think it's attached very well, but had to do with when he and his ex-wife were going through a divorce, and he was leaving. He had picked up the children from her house. He was leaving, and she and he got into an argument about something, and she wouldn't close the car door to let him leave. So he started slowly pulling away, and then she claimed that he ran over her foot. And he stayed, and the police came, and there's video out there of this that gets played a lot on conservative media. Um, and she's crying, saying he ran over her foot. Now it turns out, I mean, medical professionals came and could find no damage to her foot, so she was not seriously injured. No, whether the car did start to roll over her foot or not, she was fine. So I wanted to put that out there. But when you watch the video, you see some really interesting gender dynamics playing out. It was at the time when he was first running for the Senate, and he is fully suited, and he speaks so very humbly and softly and quietly to the officers about what happened. All right. So he adopts a posture that is the least threatening possible. And that is certainly by design. And then his ex-wife, because she's mad at him at the time, she actually does try to call that out and says, when the camera turns to her, he's an incredible actor. He's an incredible actor. Right. But the fact of the matter is, when you are, trying to reach the highest levels of power, or kind of any sanctioned power at all, as a Black man in the United States, sometimes you do have to be a bit of an actor. And, because he was probably quite angry with her, and he did not let any of that show. So yeah, so that's what we're dealing with. We're sort of dealing with one side of the pole, which can adopt all the anger and all the disregard for humanity, and then on the other side, someone who has to be superhuman and ready at every turn to both seem as upright morally, economically, et cetera, as possible, and also like they would give you the shirt off their back even if you're busy slapping them in the face.
Yeah. I mean, something you said the other day in our conversation was you have to be superhuman to be seen as human. And that really struck me. And you talk about respectability politics. To me, I look at the word respect and I say, I think it's even deeper than that. It's survivability politics. It's how to even stay alive in some cases. And I think you gave the example of the civil rights movement, where you shared about protesters, and they have the famous images with the sign of like, I'm a human too, right? And it's just, you can't be more clear than that, just wearing a suit and holding a sign that says I'm a human. And yet even that message was not widely received. So I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on that. And also if you could say more about the anger that from a gendered perspective and a racialized perspective is being asked to be shut down.
Well, that at least on one side is being shut down or asked to be shut down, on the other side is being fomented. I think with regard to the recognition of humanity, there's a way in which both halves really, both halves are actually what make the whole. So to recognize a Black man, or anyone else for that matter, as fully human, you actually have to recognize their ability to sometimes be one way and sometimes be the other, right? And there's more there than that. I don't want to break it down into sheer binary, but the fact of the matter is, sometimes, even the most well-mannered people, people who are comfortable being well-mannered, they're not, at least unto themselves, they don't feel like they're acting, right? But they get angry too. They have moments too where they, want to slap somebody. I've been looking, I mean, politics can be such a nasty game, Right. So even the fact that, this altercation, which was probably quite painful emotionally between, him and his ex-wife, has been bandied about in the media as, a reason to, as a reason that he's not perfect. Um, that that in and of itself would be enough to make someone really angry. Right? But you can't show that anger, at least in our current political racial formation in the United States, right? You can't show that anger and remain in the role that Reverend Warnock is in. To do so, here's a great example, an example that's been quite present in popular culture in the past year or so, and that would be of Will Smith. And, Will Smith getting up there on the stage and slapping another black man who gets much closer to kind of operating at the other side of the pole, too. Right. Will Smith, all respectable, movie star, very rarely is ever heard curse, even in a film. Even if you go all the way back to his hip hop days in West Philly, you look at those early music videos and whatnot, he doesn't even curse in those. It's kind of bubblegummy hip hop, compared to, it ain't Public Enemy, right? And so you look at that and you can surmise the fact that, wow, he has been playing the perfect person for decades. And he finally got mad at somebody who plays absolutely the opposite of the perfect person, right? Chris Rock's, you can't play Chris Rock's comedy albums with kids in the room. You just can't. And so he hauls off, slaps him, and the vast majority of the social criticism goes right to the guy everybody thought was perfect and everybody wanted to be perfect. Right? That's some of what's at stake when you've built up this reputation that a hegemonically white supremacist culture really demands that you build up. And when it gets punctured, man, does that balloon, pop. So there's something to be said. There is something to be said for never wrapping yourself in the balloon in the first place, right? But there are certain things that at least up until recently weren't going to happen for you if you did that, right? It's true that, to get more to matters of life and death, going through life more like Herschel Walker is much more likely to get you killed or locked up. He has just happened because of some dumb luck, honestly, but also because of the NFL and his wealth. Even though this does happen, NFL players have also gone the route of killed or locked up, mind you, but less often because there's some wealth behind them. But if you haven't made it in the NFL and you go through life like that as a black man, you're often in quite a bit of danger. And final thing I'll say to answer that question too is the kind of respectability politics. And for anyone who hasn't heard that term, that's a term that was coined by the scholar Evelyn Higginbotham to really describe the way Black women in the Black Baptist Church in the early to mid 20th century, fashioned a way of appearing above reproach in order to obtain, in order to strive for racial equality, in order to be recognized as human. And it gets used, it was a really powerful tool in the civil rights movement and beyond. But respectability politics is an approach to stereotype threat. it is a way of, looking around, seeing, actually recognizing the dangers of the stereotypes, dangers of being stereotyped, and what those can lead to, which can be matters of life or death. And you build that bubble in order to, in order to survive. I think you called it survivability politics. It's exactly what it is. So, so that's what's at stake, right? The bursting that bubble. And I still argue that to go through life the way that Walker is, or dare I say his name, the way Kanye West is right now, is incredibly, for the average person, incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Cord. And it also brings to mind another famous politician who I see on the wall behind you, Barack Obama. The juxtaposition between Obama and Trump could not be more stark when it comes to exactly what we're talking about. Trump, he wears it all on his sleeve. He is actively and explicitly aggressive and even condones violence. Barack Obama is very much more in line with Warnock in the way that he showed up. He was very much attuned to the fact that his position just in his skin, in his body, was enough of intensity for the American public, that you couldn't add much more to that and still stay in office, right? And I find it interesting that Key and Peele did a skit on Obama's anger translator, for those who may have seen that, because the feeling was that he was so kept together that he needed this other voice to kind of round him out. And, Trump doesn't need an anger translator. He needs a therapist. So that's the difference.
Absolutely. It's a really, really stark difference. And I love those anger translator skits, and they even more so than the anger translator for Barack. I kind of really enjoy the one for Michelle Obama. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, when there were moments during the Obama years when Obama, after a while, was willing to express some anger, but in some very circumscribed ways, right? He would express anger when he was speaking, at the funerals of the church members and state senator who was also pastor, killed in South Carolina, for instance. But whenever he expressed anger, he did so, again, very, very, very controlled voice, very upright poise, and fully circumscribed by moral rectitude. Right? Like, it's okay to express anger, still in a very controlled way, about mass murder. Right? That's okay. Right? But you'll notice he never expressed anger about any personal attacks levied against him, because those don't stand up to the moral rectitude test. They're too personal. They do a couple things. They humanize. They let anger in a way that, if I say I'm angry about you actually coming at me or coming at my family, then, I'm not seen to be, that's not me being angry on behalf of other helpless people, right? I've got the mic at the time, so I can't, by virtue of that, I am not helpless. And so for me to express that anger would be to get really close to bursting that bubble of respectability politics. And then, God forbid, that I actually no longer sound so controlled and put together in the fact that I'm angry over comments about, say, my wife.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot to negotiate here, and I think the choice that gets made ultimately in the increasingly purple state of Georgia will have a lot to say about what the electorate wants from Black men. Right? Do we, do we respect all the restraint that it takes to be a Reverend Warnock? Right? Because it's a heck of a lot of work. Um, you know, or do we respect not caring one way or another what anybody else thinks unto the point of being willing to put oneself and everyone else around you in danger, and that is where, yeah, we've been talking about Black masculinity, right? But that is where we get back into the realm of hegemonic American masculinity. And what do we want from that? Because, yeah, we have a long history in this country of respecting the man, usually the white man, but the man who is completely devil may care, right? The rebel riding down the desert highway at 120 on his motorcycle with no helmet on. That's freedom. Freedom to hit a twig and be killed instantly, right? It's like, is that really freedom? But no, but we tend to look at it that way. So I want to, maybe we're just about at the time where we'd want to open things up for questions, but I kind of wanted to hand it back to you there just a little bit on this question of, American masculinity and, and what this race means for that. We can't ever say outside of race because nothing's outside of race, but maybe aside from some of the things I've already brought up.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to look at because I think what you just talked about in terms of seeking out danger and thrill and freedom, that's very much part of the brand of masculinity that we see in the media. But there's also the pick yourself up by your bootstraps masculinity. There's the self-made man, this sort of notion that you built yourself from nothing and here you are today. And I think that's where there's a really interesting place to look at the intersection of masculinity and racial identity, because the self-made man, particularly when we're talking about white men, has its limits. What exactly does it mean to be self-made when you are actually benefiting, as some of my ancestors have, on the backs of slaves and the slave economy, and where extractive labor has built wealth inequality in this country that puts us at a different starting point from the very beginning. And so with that in mind, there's no such thing as the self-made man in this country. There are policies going back, hundreds of years that have given advantage to landowning white men and have disadvantaged and disenfranchised, Native folks and Black folks and other people of color and women as well. And so when we look at that history, then there's a context that allows us to understand masculine culture especially from like a white male perspective, as really kind of always being premised on a fantasy. Yeah. It's not actually real. And yet the most important job we have to continue to be seen as masculine is not to question any of that, not to question that false premise. And so the moment you question it, that's when, you lose belonging in your peer group. Don't talk about that. We don't talk about that here. Come on, man. What are you, a feminist? Right. And so these words get sort of slanderized and turned into attacks because it's all about keeping us in line so that we don't rock the boat. And who benefits from that, most is landowning white men, right? Yeah. And so, but I will say that there's another component here that feels really important to weave in whenever I talk about the white male lens or about masculinity in general, which is that there is a cost to us. There is a cost to our own humanity as well. And I don't want that to get lost. Like, yes, we are benefiting from an enormous amount of privilege and access and safety in this system as white men. And there's a real cost in terms of our capacity to be introspective, to be emotionally aware and expressive, to have, real relationship skills, to look critically at our lives and actually be willing to grow and evolve and be challenged. But also in terms of health outcomes, it's middle-aged and older white men who are most at risk for suicide, who are most at risk for loneliness and other really painful mental health issues that come from an isolationist worldview and a culture that tells us that we don't belong. And then we have to keep trying to prove ourselves just to have an opportunity to connect. And so the vast emptiness of man box culture, as Tony Porter calls it, is so incredibly apparent in the pain and the suffering that men across racial identities are experiencing, and that these systems of oppression that at the same time benefit us disproportionately are also in some cases a death wish for us as well.
Right. So there's a way in which, for the Black man who chooses like the Walker way, right, is kind of choosing, it's asking for the right, it's sort of demanding the right to be in a man box that's death dealing anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, okay. So what I'm hearing here is that the choice is between two very different kinds of constraint. One of which is about survivability, or trying to survive in a system stacked against you. The other one being about, really trying to advance the right to get into a different kind of box, maybe seeing the dangers in it, maybe not seeing the dangers in it at all. But I think we should maybe open it up for some questions there.
Yeah, I love that idea. And just really quick, I want to say I appreciate you framing this as two binds. You're stuck in a box on this side, you're stuck in a box on that side. And there is a way in which Walker's brand of masculinity and Black masculinity could be seen as liberating from a certain kind of construct, right? But then from the other view, it's incredibly just, it's creating a reification of patriarchy and a reification of power stratification and difference that is, like you said, it creates huge harm for the communities that he represents. And so just fascinating to look at how it's not clean cut, it's complex. And that what exactly is liberation, and liberation from what, is a really interesting question. So yeah, happy to pass to Leslie to help us with some questions. And I'll also open up the chat. So if folks want to put questions there, that's the best way to go ahead and engage in the conversation. So let me do that real quick here. All right, the chat is open. And Leslie, you are unmuted.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am connected to these two amazing men because I work with them at Sagely. I'm the founder of Sagely, and we do leadership coaching and DEI work. And I am going to, if you have any questions you'd like to put into the chat, I'd be happy to read them. I just want to thank you. I loved this conversation. And one of the things that was connecting for me, we kind of, it was just beautiful the way you got it back to this idea of kind of a man box, because I was connecting that with the stories that you started out with, which were two stories of times that you came out of the man box, right? And all the kind of emotions and everything that came with that. So I'd actually love to hear more from both of you about what that experience is like, how you've learned to do that. I'd love to hear more.
Go ahead, Cord.
Oh man. I mean, it's, it's a process. I would say there, I don't know where it came from, but there are certain things that I was never willing to compromise to be in the man box or in a particular Black man box. Um, and some of those kind of forced me to have to reject the man box a bit. Because growing up, there were certain things I refused to do. I was, well, I'll put it this way. Part of the box that Herschel Walker's in, right, is the unlearned, you can't be smart box, right? Which, as I was saying, has become more and more of a problem with the man box generally beyond race in the Western world. But I also came from a household that put a lot of emphasis on education. And my mother is still the head of a nonprofit organization that gives out scholarships. So just everything was about education. My father was a PR executive, but also an amateur James Baldwin scholar. All right. So, already someone who, so I'm surrounded by the works of James Baldwin growing up, which of course are already challenge man boxes in any number of ways. But, going to a mostly Black school in elementary school, being smart and only speaking the King's English outside the household was not exactly looked upon with a friendly eye by my by my fellow students. All right, so I heard a lot of insults, a lot of a lot of insults, and some of those insults would go directly to my sexuality, because if you're smart and you speak the King's English and you're not that great at basketball, and I was not at the time, I'm pretty good now, but I wasn't then, you must be gay. And to be gay in the 80s and, the 80s and very early 90s, right, was much harder. It's still hard, don't get me wrong, but it was much harder then. Also, I was smart, but I hadn't been reading Eve Sedgwick. I wasn't doing gender studies yet, right? So, so those things were very hurtful, but at the same time, they allowed me from a very early age to say, well, to hell with this man box. I didn't have that language for it at the time, but to hell with this man box, because this is not working. This is not where I am. So,
thanks for that,
and
Cord.
how about you?
Yeah, to hell with the man box. I like that. Yeah, it took me quite a while to recognize that actually in my 20s, I was afraid of and ashamed of my masculinity. And so I just thought, well, maybe if I become more feminine and just de-emphasize my masculinity, then everything's gonna be fine. It wasn't. I was controlling, I was manipulative, I was insecure, a lot of fear, a lot of tension in my system because I wasn't in balance. There was some big part of me that was missing that I'd found too hard to love in myself. And so it wasn't until I started finding healthier male role models that I thought to myself, oh, there's something really beautiful here. This is really important. Masculinity is an important part of who I am. And I need to find a balance so that I can really show up in my authentic power in the world. So that continues to be my journey, but it's a journey that has led me to do this work with others, to work with men around cultivating a wholehearted approach of masculinity rather than a fragmented approach or a man box approach. And I think it's interesting because from a racialized perspective, I haven't had some of what you shared, some of the intensity that you've experienced around a Black experience of masculinity. I think the stereotype threat, for example, I think for white men might be more of a status threat. And it's because the basic survival need, the basic safety need is generally met. But then beyond that, there's the competition for who's going to outperform the people around you, who's going to push and win and shove and kick and be the best, the king of the mountain approach. And that's what capitalism has oriented us to engage in, but it's also what patriarchy has oriented us to engage in. And it's what white supremacy is premised on, which is the idea of having to be above the other person or the other group. And so if I'm going to keep feeling significant, feeling like I'm valuable, that I even deserve to exist on this earth as a white man, then I have to go and perform and achieve and show that I'm better than someone else, or ideally better than most people. And I think that carries a really intense weight and pressure that then fuels the very same cycle of dehumanization and inequality, and causes a lot of harm that we then can't speak about and can't fully feel or process because we have had our emotional capacity undermined by that very same culture. So it's an absolute double bind. And it's interesting to note that even from a white racialized lens, masculinity itself is so inherently disruptive and dehumanizing in the way it's been we've been enculturated into it, that it is allowing us to perpetuate unequal and oppressive systems where we are all dehumanized. And what it's going to take to change that, it feels like it really comes down to rehumanizing ourselves in community and recognizing that we're not alone and that we need to stand in our authentic power together to be a part of creating meaningful change.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, thank you for that, Dan. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's standing in that authentic power, right? And that's some of what I'm getting at when I'm talking about the fact that we have to re-merge the Warnock side and the Walker side, right? We have to re-merge them because those are all elements of humanity. Yeah, Leslie, do we have any other questions in the chat?
There was one more question that I actually thought was really great, and I thought we might speak to this one, and then we might wrap up, and we can always respond more over email later. But one of the other questions was from Amy. We were talking about kind of what does it feel like when we're really listening to and thinking about the way that masculinity is dehumanizing for men whose the way that they show up and in masculine is actually really harmful or hurtful for us, right, as women. And I think sort of the conclusion that you were kind of bringing it back around to, Dan, I think was really lovely, which was this is bad for all of us, right? And that can be very hard to see because it can be so painful. When you are a victim of sexism and racism and abuse and all these things that it's part of the human experience. And so I think part of the allyship work that we do is, helping people understand, like, you're not in this to be a nice person to other people. You're in this because this is bad for you. So that was a question that Amy had, and that's a little bit of my answer to it, because I'm really identifying with what she means about, it is hard. It's hard to hear that it's difficult for the people who have actually, their dehumanization has been harmful. So I just wanted to bring that up, but I wanted to ask the two of you if you have something else to say about that.
I'm happy to chime in on that.
Yeah, I went first last time. So
I'd love to hear from you next, Cord. Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you, Amy, for bringing this up. I think I choose to be pretty careful in how I talk about white male pain because, typically because there are a lot of caveats and a lot of context that makes that helpful or unhelpful. Because yes, on the one hand, we have enormous opportunity and access and privilege and safety and advantage and historic wealth and all these things. And also we are perpetuating a lot of the harm. We're authoring a lot of the harm that people are experiencing, including amongst ourselves, but also with other groups. And so all of that being said, it begs the question, there's a saying, hurt people hurt people. And so the question that I have been asking for a long time is, what is the pain in us that's finding expression out through violence against other people? Because that violence doesn't just come from nowhere. Little boys aren't born violent. Little white boys aren't any more violent or aggressive than anybody else. So what is it in our culture, in our society, just in the air we breathe together, that is leading to these outcomes? And I think it's a combination of the ignorance by design. And we don't see the ways the systems are moving through us, the ways that racism and sexism and homophobia are moving through us, particularly as white men, because we don't have to. There's no urgency to that for us to get through our world and our daily life and our career without a block, whereas it's not true for other groups often. And so it's that ignorance by design, designed to be invisible on the one hand, but then it's also the pain of almost being hazed into manhood. It's almost like a fraternity culture of, don't rat out the brotherhood. Don't like say something bad about this other guy, bros before hoes, like really intense stuff that people learn in middle school, that you learn in the locker room, or you learn in the sports team, or you learn wherever. And that kind of, or at home. Yeah. That kind of mentality tends to have us get really quiet when it comes to these issues, and to find that it's scary and dangerous to lean into them. And it's not for us. This work isn't for us. And so then we shy away from the very doorway that would lead us into our own liberation, because we see it as a threat to our belonging with our peer group inside of, white supremacy culture. So it's another bind, and it's a challenging one.
Yeah, and I love what you say about the fact that violence doesn't come from nothing, because nothing comes from nothing. So when we do see, white male supremacist violence on the big explicit order and on the implicit death by 1,000 cuts order too, right? These sort of implicit ways of who the white man in control of hiring doesn't hire, or who in their office they make that person's life hard for, or that sort of thing. When that kind of stuff is going on, I think it's absolutely coming from a denial of, it is coming from an internal denial of one's full self, right? Because surely there are things that the white man in question there has wanted to do at some point, or ways they have wanted to be, from as small as, tasting that guava drink, all the way up to trying to suppress their own sexual orientation, from something as small to as big as that. That they, if you deny that to yourself, that is a violence. And that violence is going to find its way out. It always finds its way out. And it does so, if you can't deal with it, if you can't actually come to terms with it and allow yourself to be who you want to be, regardless of what culture says to you, or forget regardless, in opposition sometimes to what culture or family or the people right around you or your old friend group, regardless of what they say and how they'll react, sometimes just how you fear they'll react. If you can't get past that and you're doing that violence to yourself, you're going to do it to somebody else. Right? You're going to find the people who represent in some way or another that part of yourself that you're denying, and you're going to try to deny them. And that, I think that's that's where real danger lies. And we see it happening all the time. But there is hope. There is hope. And, we have to end on a hopeful note, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, Cord,
yeah. We can get hopeful. Let's do this. We got like a few more minutes.
Do we? I think we're supposed to be done about that.
Let's just take like 2 or 3 more minutes to actually be really helpful about it, right? Because that's the kind of radical notion that we're working with is the love has to come inward, right? Yeah. It's I mean, Dan, you said it was beautiful that some of these things lead us to shy away from the door to our own liberation, right? Mm-hmm. And that's meant there's something, that ability to really love yourself through all of these things, right? And so that what comes out is love, right? And so I think there's this invitation to wholeness in looking at the ways that Walker and Warnock kind of embodied two poles. What would it look like for that pressure to just be a little bit less on both sides? For there not to have to be an anger translator, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. That's a great question too. It's a great point and a great question. One of the things I think gets us there is, just allowing ourselves little liberties at a time, right? No, don't take it to, some of us are very bold people, and we can just go all the way to that thing that we've been denying ourselves and be like, I'm done, and casting off this box. But I think for most people, small little cuts in the box, really committing to doing little things. Like for me, it's this whole new nail painting with sports teams thing, right? Like, it's both gender, a little bit gender progressive, and they're still sports teams. So, still that's, but doing that kind of thing, just looking for the little places where you have been denying yourself, and the little places where, where you want to challenge the status quo, and then doing it, and then being like, oh, that was okay. All right, maybe I'll do it in this slightly bigger way, and in this slightly bigger way. And that way we start to love ourselves more and remerge ourselves more between the accepted and the rejected parts of ourselves. The more and more people do that, the more, just, statistically, the more and more people do that, then the more and more people who are doing that kind of thing who end up being the ones running for office anyway.
Yeah. I love that, Cord. And just to add to that, we hear a lot about toxic masculinity, for example. And the first thing that a lot of guys I've often heard hear in that is they hear, you think I'm toxic. There's something inherently wrong with me, right? And the same thing with racism. You think I'm racist. You're calling me a racist, right? And I think what gives me, I'm getting to the hope. What gives me such profound hope is recognizing the difference between the bad actor notion of racism or sexism, where, there are individual racists and individual sexists who are these monsters, and you're calling me one of them, to instead recognizing the structural nature of these systems of oppression, the structural nature of racism and sexism, and the way that they move through each of us, regardless of our intentions, that they are impacting and influencing us. And so as I've been able to separate out from the individualistic perspective to the structural perspective, I've been able to say, oh, I have a choice. There is nothing inherently racist about me, or inherently sexist, or inherently bad or toxic. I am choosing how I'm going to either uphold or resist the systems that I was enculturated into. And there are many others choosing to resist. So I can join in that resistance. And that resistance can be a humanizing and liberatory force in my life, and support work in the world that is also serving that cause. And as I've begun to build community and find others who are doing that work, then I'm not so alone anymore. And the price that I initially was afraid to pay, the price of loss of belonging, loss of status, etc., actually feels like I've gained so much more now. Gaining connection, gaining emotional humanity and expressiveness and agility. And I think when we see that there's another way that's possible, there are other cultures of masculinity, there are other ways to be in a white male body in this world that aren't just about maintaining the status quo or feeling terrible about it, but we can actually move into something together across lines of difference, then that becomes a much more powerful narrative for us each to live into and be co-authors of.
Yeah.
I love that. And with that, I'm going to sign off. And thank you so much for joining us. And we really appreciate it. Dan and Cord, thank you so much for your insights. And we will, oh, by the way, we will put this recording up on our site and we'll send it out to everyone who was registered for the event. So thank you.